Liminal spaces are a popular internet trend that began to take off around the time of the pandemic. Simply described, they are spaces that were never meant to be inhabited, but are now entirely abandoned. These are spaces meant to be passed through, but they tend to be inhabited in a rotation. One party leaves while the next comes in, and so on. The term transitional is also often used to describe these spaces. Settings that qualify as liminal may include a school at night, a dying mall, a store that is closing or closed down, an empty office space, or a scarcely furnished home, which could either be caught in between moving in or moving out. What brings these spaces into the uncanny is that they are not serving their primary function and taken out of their correct context. They often encourage repressed memories to once more resurface. In other words, the familiar spaces that are functional and purposeful at the right times become unfamiliar, unwelcoming, devoid of feeling, and even terrifying at other times. For example, on any given weekday, we can see a schoolyard with children playing, laughing, and running. We then see the same playground on a weekend night, and it looks eerie with a lone swing blowing in the wind, evocative of what was and no longer is. Oftentimes, the images can spark a childhood nostalgia, otherwise known as repressed memories, and we can imagine ourselves in these locations as children. Other times, they feel as though we have seen these locations in dreams. The Aesthetic Wiki chronicles the trend. The trend began when someone posted this image on 4chan, categorizing it among disquieting images that just feel off. This is where the internet trend began, but the concept can be traced back to movies such as The Shining. The term liminal stems from the Latin word limen, which Oxford Languages describes to be a threshold below which a stimulus is not perceived or not distinguished from another. Oxford Languages describes liminal as relating to a transitional or initial stage of a process. Liminal spaces, then, have been seen as a transitional space between what was and what is. Liminal spaces are primarily used in a psychological sense. They are described as physical, physiological, and psychological transitional zones. They're the area between your starting point and your destination. So not only are they physical in-between spaces, but also emotional. The main question is, what gives these spaces the eeriness that is so characteristic of them? Liminal spaces are often tied to Sigmund Freud's Uncanny. Sigmund Freud is an Austrian neurologist, known as the father of psychoanalysis, who coined the term uncanny from his native German unheimlich. Unheimlich literally translates to not homelike, or unhomely. It's that which is unfamiliar, strange, eerie, and uncomfortable. This contrasts to heimlich, or homely, which is safe or belonging to the house. A lesser used definition for canny is that which is secret, deceitful, or private. In turn, canny can be defined as that which is unsecret, or when something that was meant to be concealed is no longer hidden. A modern example I can use is the recession of 2008. Many of us were children, so you would have been unaware of the financial strain put on our parents. But if we were to have found out, that would have been unsettling. Essentially, just because something is kept secret does not mean that it is always a good secret being kept from you. To tie this back to Freud, Freud deals with the ego, the superego, and the id. Essentially, the ego is the self, with the superego being almost like the angel on your shoulder and the id being the devil. How does this all connect to the uncanny? Well, let's dive into that. The superego represses many things that would lead to uncanniness in the ego. This includes any negativity, but it also does so to anything too unrealistic, such as utopian dreams, wishes, and hopes. Primarily, these are suppressed following childhood, and if they are to return in adulthood, this is those memories becoming unsecret and leading to a sort of uncanniness. When something is no longer suppressed by the superego, it marks a return to a primitive state of being. Here's a quote from German and English professor Robert Gray of the University of Washington to help us better understand. The uncanny is anything we experience in adulthood that reminds us of earlier psychic stages, of aspects of our unconscious life, or of the primitive experiences of the human species. Dr. Barry Laga, a professor of literature and composition at Colorado Mesa University, wrote more feedback on Freud's concept of the uncanny, stating that the uncanny deals with what is familiar, with a particular kind of fear, dread, or repulsion. As the summary progresses, Laga states that repression is at work when it comes to the uncanny, as different aspects of life are buried, only to reemerge without notice, which converts that emotional impulse into fear. It is said that the fear that arises from the unexpected resurgence of a repressed aspect is due to the fact that it should have remained hidden. This converts comfort into unhomeliness. Let's tie this into liminal spaces. Liminal spaces tend to be images of hotels, classrooms, hallways of different types, airports, and other public spaces, but they can also be homes, as was mentioned earlier. When it comes to pictures of liminal houses, they tend to be abandoned or have a nostalgic early 2000s vibe, as those who participate most in the trend grew up in this time. As we recall, the superego suppresses any discomfort from the past, but also anything too unrealistic for when we pass childhood. Seeing these images tends to evoke a sense of dread, as the spaces look vaguely familiar and feel as though a memory from the past is being called back or no longer suppressed. Memories that were meant to be secret are now becoming unsecret. Most importantly, they are not fully unsecret. The photos depict images vaguely familiar, which may create the effect of being halfway unsecret. Memory is half recalled, as the generic spaces partially call to mind past memories, but often not enough for full recall. This connects to a term called anemoia, which Collins' dictionary describes as nostalgia for a time one has never known, meaning a false sense of nostalgia. Lacan has three registers that describe the human experience: the imaginary, the real, and the symbolic. We will primarily be focusing on the real, but we will still touch upon the other registers. This information is for the most part pulled from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The real is described by Purdue University's College of Liberal Arts as a natural state that exists outside of language, from which we were severed by our entrance into language. This source explains that the real can be found in a basic need and a search for satisfaction, and that animals and babies are capable of this because they have not yet separated themselves from the world through language. The real is impossible because of language, but its presence is marked by its unattainability. The source also claims that the real continues to erupt whenever we are made to acknowledge the materiality of our existence, which is manifested in disruptions to our sense of self that may stem from traumatic or profound moments. Connecting to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the real in Lacanian terms intrinsically resists capture, evading concrete meaning. This evasiveness parallels the nature of liminal spaces, which lack fixed purpose or coherent meaning, contributing to their uncanny quality. Lacan describes the real as never more and never less than sheer indifferent plenitude, a state of fullness that, in liminal spaces, is marked by emptiness, yet somehow feels charged with meaning. As popular video essayist Solar Sand says, if walls could speak, they would say nothing. Liminal spaces, much like the real, carry a presence that feels outside of language or purpose. Their fullness lies precisely in this silent, unfixed nature. To explore further, Lacan notes, the real involves convergence of opposites, oscillations between excesses and lacks, surpluses and deficits, flooding presences and draining absences. Liminal spaces embody these contradictions. They feel empty yet unsettlingly full, familiar yet strange, hovering between presence and absence. This duality intensifies the uncanny atmosphere of these spaces. Finally, liminal spaces evoke feelings of unease, anxiety, or discomfort that brings us face to face with the real's contingent traumatic events, unbearable bodily intensities, anxiety, and death. Like the real, they awaken memories or emotions that are hard to place, confronting us with a sense of both emptiness and fullness that lies just beyond language. The symbolic deals with language, societal norms, and laws, and cultural practices. Lacan says that the unconscious is structured like a language. This means that it has a logical structure like that of a language. Like language, the symbolic also uses senseless signifiers, or symbols that exist without a distinct meaning. Interestingly enough, the symbolic is also very much contrary to liminal spaces. Again from the encyclopedia. This non-natural universe is an elaborate set of intersubjective and transsubjective contexts into which individual human beings are thrown at birth, a pre-existing order preparing places for them in advance. These spaces are meant to have context, with orders already set in stone. However, liminal spaces lack purpose and order, keeping the viewers in an unsettling in-between state. We're also given the ability to use the symbolic in a way that helps us to understand the world around us through language. The unconscious, being part of a symbolic anti-nature in and of itself, is to be interpretively engaged with via the symbolic medium of speech, namely the very substance of the being in itself of the speaking subject. Language is shown to allow us to interact with and understand our experiences, which is what a liminal space is not about. Instead, they leave us in an uncanny feeling, potentially with the thought of if our nostalgia is true or fabricated. The final register is the imaginary. The imaginary is who or what one imagines oneself to be, including from the imagined perspectives of others, and its tie-in to liminal spaces has to do with transference and fantasy. Transference is described as one's directed feelings and/or desires tied to someone important, an example being a parent, that are now directed towards another person. Tying this to liminal spaces, transferences may be the fake sense of nostalgia for one point in life, being transferred to the images being seen. The Stanford Encyclopedia talks about the detached from reality nature of the imaginary. With his choice of the word imaginary, Lacan indeed intends to designate that which is fictional, simulated, virtual, and the like. However, the phenomena of the imaginary are necessary illusions, or real abstractions, integral to, and have very concrete effects upon the actual, factual, human realities. Liminal spaces are often described as feeling like an in-between of reality and fantasy, and this quote ties well into that sense of feeling. The Stanford Encyclopedia states that the imaginary can also be confused for both the real and the symbolic, which also has an interesting tie-in for liminal spaces. Raw feelings that stem from the real can be confused for the imaginary self-perception, which makes it seem as though liminal spaces are the bearers of our transferred feelings. The Stanford Encyclopedia says that the imaginary draws on sociolinguistic structures and dynamics, which is built up by the symbolic, to fuel sensory perceptual phenomena. On this point, with liminal spaces, it shows how the sensory effects given are based on the symbolic. I want to tie this into two personal aspects, one being Star Wars, which is a franchise that I've loved since I was like 7 years old. The second is a personal story.
And you must go.
What's in there?
Only what you take with you.
Besides anemoia, which, if we remember, is a false sense of nostalgia, liminal spaces can have aspects of truth. Think back with me to places where you may have experienced a transition. This ties us back to our psychological definition of liminal spaces, namely in terms of transference, which, if we recall, is the directing of feelings and/or desires onto another party. In this case, Luke is transferring his fears of Vader into this space. What Luke brought into the cave is his fear of Darth Vader, as well as his fear of becoming Vader. The Dagobah cave is a good example of a liminal space. Luke was not shown anything new, but rather a representation of his suppressed fears. This suppression ties into Freud's Uncanny. Another connection to the Uncanny is the familiar, Luke's own face, becoming unfamiliar, as it is now the face of the man he fears. What would Lacan say? That this encounter goes with the real in a sense that goes beyond words. Luke never has to say what his fears are. They are instead embodied. It is also found in the uncertainty of Luke's future. Now let me tell you my personal story. In the summer before my junior year of high school, I was like many other high schoolers and had a crush on someone who I barely even spoke to. Obviously, things didn't work out. And at that point, I realized that I had wasted my time, but most importantly, her time. So I reflected on all of this guilt. I went with my family to Los Angeles for a little day trip. My sister and I went on a walk and found the subway entrance and just decided to go in. It was almost like the cave, since the entrance was above ground like a tunnel, and went deep into the ground. So if Luke brought his fears into his cave, I brought my guilt into mine. It was an empty terminal, not abandoned, but just not inhabited at that moment. And I felt like I was bringing all my guilt and what was weighing on me from my little situation. We descended downstairs in escalators, and with each flight, I felt like I came deeper into my guilt. When we reached the bottom, I felt like I was entirely in the guilt, but like I could let it all go and leave it behind here. It felt cathartic to be here, as if it was where I could release all of what I reflected upon. I went back almost 5 years later on a trip with my friends, since they wanted to see my liminal space. We entered, we descended, and we reached the bottom, and the entire way down, I felt nothing. If the first time I brought my guilt, the second time I brought nothing. I realized that I was just a young teenager with teenage problems. This space lost the context it once had because I had long since grown from being a teenager. Back then, I was in between guilt and forgiving myself from guilt, a transitional space, a psychological liminal space. And when I revisited, I was not in any in-between space in my life. Let's tie this back to Freud and Lacan. The uncanny occurred because I was in a vaguely familiar space. It wasn't my first time in a subway terminal. And that was in a strange context. My guilt was being uncovered, almost as if it was no longer being suppressed. The next time I visited was still empty, aside from my friends and me, so it was still fairly liminal. The one thing that did not exist was the suppressed, as I didn't bring anything unresolved, no unresolved feelings in. Lacan would say that on entering my cave, I was encountering my feelings of guilt that words could not describe. The liminal space was the void that is the real, and the catharsis was confrontation and expulsion of the real guilt. On my return to the site, the real was no longer present, as there was no emotion beyond language to expose myself to, so it was all moved into the symbolic, where language and logic rule. Disregarding Star Wars lore, if Luke were to go back into his cave, no longer afraid of Vader, would the cave still hold this context? The cave is still uncanny, as it's an empty space, but he's no longer witnessing the familiar becoming unfamiliar. The real, so his emotions without words, are no longer present. We all have our cave, where we've encountered the uncanny and the real. And I hope that through this video, you can reflect on such a space, and how you have transitioned and grown since then.